Hi, this is going to be my talk on how to be critical in your writing. I want to start off a little bit of background just to say that I find that students often think that being able to be critical in your writing is some kind of magical power that is difficult to acquire. However, we all have the ability to be critical. It's just sometimes it best suits us to be critical. We can, and it's to understand what's behind that. And I believe if you understand what's behind that, then you can always dig down and get that critical element. Okay, so here is a picture that I believe sums up being critical. As soon as I seen this picture, I knew it would be the one I would use for my talk. So here we have a football. Here we have a football fan at a football match. Now he's being critical. That's obvious. He is being critical in this picture. And the way his face is slightly contorted to me says that it's not positive criticism. But it absolutely sums it up. So I want to take you through an example of how he could be being critical. So he could be being critical. He could be pointing at the manager of his team, the manager of the other team, one of his players, one of the opposition's players, or the referee. And he's making this judgment. He's doing this evaluation of them. So I want to take you through how one of those evaluations might go. So say he's pointing at his own goalkeeper and he's saying, do you know, as goalkeepers go, you're rubbish. You're a rubbish goalkeeper. And I thought I'd stand up and point at you and shout and tell you you're rubbish. And the reason he can do that is, as you know, and what he may also be saying is because, and the reason I can call you rubbish is that the job of a goalkeeper, as I understand it, is you've got to keep the ball out of the net. You're the last line of defence. You should be stopping the ball. If the ball gets to you, you should stop it going in the net and stop it being a goal. However, so far in this football game, I have watched you pick the ball out of the net 4 times, and it's not even half time yet. So he's saying, based on what I know, I can criticise you. And that's valid. And his criticism is valid under those circumstances. His criticism is valid. Okay. So essentially what happened here is that the person there standing at the football match took what should be, and he used it to evaluate what is. So what should be, he said, what a goalkeeper should be is somebody who stops the ball out going in the net. And then he compares that with what is actually happening. What is it? What is actually the thing being evaluated? His current goalkeeper. And his current goalkeeper is letting the ball in. So he stands up and he says, so just to say that the what it should be is often expressed as a theory or a model or a concept by academics. That is very often the place you go for your tool of evaluation, the way you critique something. In this case, it would be the theory of goalkeeping. And, and what it is, then you look to what you're evaluating, the thing being evaluated, what it actually is, and you're looking for evidence of what's practically happening there. And it's a comparison between the two. It's a comparison between the two. And I have an example. So what it should be, here I'm going to talk about business ethics because business ethics seems to be the subject, or ethics in business seems to be one of the main thrusts of the module you're doing. So if I was to generally look at business ethics, I would say that there are, if a company is being ethical, which they may demonstrate through corporate social responsibility, if they're being ethical, the three basic things are they'll treat their workers fairly, they will respect the environment, and they will treat customers fairly. Okay, so these are the things that should be happening. And then what you could do is you could look at the practices that a company uses on the other side of the slide in grey, and see all the practices that represent what the theory is, what businesses do or don't do. And then you can make a judgment. So if an ethical business is supposed to treat workers fairly, but they offer the gig economy, they employ people under a gig economy where there's no set hours, there's no guarantee of a wage, etc., then you could say that that's unethical. If a company outsources to somewhere where they know they can get a labour force that is cheaper, but the reason it's cheaper comes at a price due to working conditions, then you could say that's unethical. So you can start to look. So what I'm saying is, if you want to see if a company is ethical, then the thing that allows you to evaluate it is to say they should be treating workers fairly, and then you can look at the company and see what they're doing with that. The next thing is, does the company respect the environment? And a positive thing may be that the company is carbon neutral, so they are not excessive in the carbon output. They are taking measures to counterbalance the carbon output they have by planting trees or whatever. Or it could be that they're doing something that doesn't respect the environment, where the way they dispose of they create too much waste. They create waste when there perhaps is no need, and therefore they're doing something that is not what it should be. Treating customers fairly. So an ethical business treats customers fairly. And the one example I could think of was, if you're offering credit, if your customers can't buy what you're selling outright, and you offer them credit, which is very expensive, it has a very high interest rate, then you can say they're not being ethical with that. Okay. Another thing I want to talk about is understanding how to critically analyze, or what critical analysis is. And I want to ask you two questions. So the first question is, what score out of 10 would you give the NHS for the way they handled the pandemic? What score out of 10 would you give the NHS for the way they've handled? Right, that's the first thing. So think of a number. Okay, what number for it? Right, okay. What score out of 10 would you give Trump for the way he's been president in the United States? What score out of 10 would you give Trump for the way he's done that, right? Now, I've done this in a few classes. I've kind of given this talk, and when it came to giving a score to the NHS, most people gave high scores, between 7 and 10. Quite naturally, there was very little disagreement in that. That's most folk, given the circumstances that the NHS had done a good job with the pandemic. So people quite naturally gave them high scores. They could understand the situation, they could make a critical evaluation, and for this question, they would evaluate it and say, well, we understand what a health service is supposed to do. We think they've done a good job. Then when it came to Trump, most people gave low scores for some reason. And the thing was, there was generally an agreement over the scores he got. They were all low. I don't think there was one that was above 5, and certainly low. Some people tried to give him a negative score. I'm just saying. Okay, so the interesting thing here is people were able to critically evaluate, and the people seem to have a consensus over the score. So that shows you how we can all do it, how we can all critically evaluate. The only difference is that in the things that we'll be talking about later, you have to look to see what it is you can pull together to evaluate what you've been given the task to evaluate. Okay. Another quick thing I want to talk about is always remember that there's a mix. This is just a brief point, but when you're criticizing something or you're being critical, it's generally a mix. You can be positive or negative, but it's usually a mix that you put together. So basically, if we go back to the NHS, when you talk about the NHS, most of the things that you would write, if you had an essay to do, you would write mostly positive things because it got a high score. That you can think and pick out all the positive things that the NHS did to tackle the pandemic. And then arguably if you had to write an essay about Trump, that you would be able to find, or there would be numerous negative things that could be brought in. There might be a few positive things, but overall, I think there would be enough negative things to represent the negative feeling that people have for him. I don't think that that's generally misplaced. But the important thing is it's a mix. You're not trying to go out to clobber something to make it all look as negative as possible, and you're never going out to make something look positive. You're looking to accurately reflect how good or how bad it is. That's the important thing. So that, in my understanding, that kind of turns you into a theatre critic. Another way of looking at, and that mixed critique is very much like a theatre critic or a film critic or somebody who's a food critic. And interestingly, sometimes they give you a rating, 5 stars, 4 stars. Or if they're going out for a food, it'll be 3 forks, 5 forks. This was tremendous, or 1 fork, whatever. So there's usually that numerical kind of thing, and then they'll give a written piece underneath to explain why. So you could go to a play and you can say the direction was fantastic, the scenery was great, the acting was great, etc. And that would be a 5-star rating because most everything was positive. Or you could go in and you could say, well, they couldn't act, they couldn't sing, they couldn't dance, the scenery kept falling over, I couldn't hear them where I was sitting, blah, blah, blah. You'll find it generally it's a mix. Nothing's usually that bad or that good. Yes, so when you're in a new situation, when you're given something and you're trying to work out what kind of things you can be critical about, there is a handful of questions which can help you look for information or help you think about things that something can be critiqued positively and negatively for. And those there are more questions than this, but for me, I think these are very useful. So the first one is something effective or ineffective. You can critique something on the fact that it works or it doesn't work. If you can get evidence to say something is effective, then that's a positive thing. This thing works. You say, great. Or it might be ineffective, whatever that may be. But that's an area to look at. Another one is expense. When you're doing anything, arguably if something's expensive, it tends to go against it unless, obviously, if something is effective, very effective, even though it's expensive, it may be worth the value. But expense is not generally thought of as a positive thing, generally. Quite literally, if something's dangerous or safe, I mean, that's another thing where if you're looking at something like, if you're talking about outsourcing labor, is it dangerous or safe to exploit workers in another country where they may have less? So you could bring that critique. That's one of the things against outsourcing, is that generally the laborers are put perhaps in more dangerous situations than they would be elsewhere. Is it popular or unpopular? Because that's another valuable side of things, because you could have something that's effective, it's inexpensive, and it's safe, but yet it's not popular for some reason. And that's an issue. That would be an issue. And also a couple of other really useful ones is If it's supposed to do something, does it? If it's supposed to solve a problem, does it solve that problem? Or in fact, does it create one? Solve one problem, but create others. For example, somebody could say, we have a problem, we have a shortage of housing. So shortage of housing, well, we're just going to build you a bunch of houses. There you go. Problem solved. But what happens is perhaps the people build the houses all in one place. And although they solved the problem that everybody who needs a house has a house, the local schools can't cope with all the extra people. The roads can't cope. The local shops can't cope. So sometimes in trying to fix one problem, if you're not careful, you can create others. And of course, with so many things in life, who benefits from this? And often you will find that in the world of business, not all the time, but sometimes in the world of business, it may be the employees that suffer where the people in charge benefit. So something may benefit certain groups of people. For example, in the recent recession, people who were in highly paid positions, their actual rewards and salaries increased, whereas the majority of workers suffered a decrease in their spending ability. And finally, where does it work best? So you're looking at something, and another thing is you can say, well, it's effective and it's inexpensive and it's this and it's that, but it only works in a big company. It's a big company that benefits best from that, not a small company. A small company can't afford it, or a small company can't this. So, or you might get something else that works best in a small company rather than a big company, or works better in a developed economy than a developing economy. So there's a whole group of questions that are useful to you that can help you think about things that you can look for or investigate. You can you can criticize almost anything. Okay, so it can be, funnily enough, you can critique a concept or a theory or a process or a policy or a phenomenon. And you can also, obviously, you can critique people, which is generally done through the actions they do, the actions of an academic or a political figure or a professional. So people will be taking a critical look at Donald Trump, they'll be taking a critical look at Boris Johnson, they'll be taking a critical look at lots of people who are doing things, and they may found to be doing a good thing and be positively, critically, positively, or not, or negatively critiqued. So where do you get the evidence? And I think this is quite an important one. Where do you get the evidence that you use? So mainly, in my belief, mostly where the information comes from academics. As I said, one of the most common ways you can do it is you'll have a theory of how things should be, and you use that and you see if those things are actually happening. And that's the most common place. So when you are looking to critique something, you will be scanning academic books and journals, looking for those key things that should be happening and seeing if they are actually taking place. Or you can be scanning the academics for those kind of things that academics who say if something's effective or does what it's supposed to do, if it solves problems, etc. You can scan for all those different things. The other thing is you can use logic to a degree, that you can make links in what you've written. When one academic says something and another academic says something else, then you can logically say that this is an issue, or this is a good thing, this is a positive thing, or this is a negative thing. So you may find out logic if you say there's a something that can be done For example, I think, yeah, when the new vaccine came out and it was told you had to store it minus 70 degrees, and they said that's not easy to do, then logically you said that is going to cause issues for its distribution. As soon as you get something that cannot go above minus 70 degrees, which is very difficult to keep at minus 70 degrees in the first place, logically you could say that that's going to cause issues because you can't to move it about, etc. So I think that's fair. Also, don't forget to use opinions. Now, opinions come from useful opinions with authority come from professionals. So if you've got people who make comment in interviews, or you have websites where professionals gather, marketing professionals gather, and write articles or exchange anecdotes, etc. And there are websites about. I found a branding website where continually professionals would come on and discuss issues of the day and what they thought and what they'd done. And those opinions of professionals who are successful have an authority that you could use. Okay. And plus don't forget to use examples. When the theory says that if something happens, it can be detrimental, and then you find newspaper stories or articles in the press that show you these examples of that happening. I mean, the Rana Plaza collapse, if you're not aware of it, very briefly, the Rana Plaza collapse happened when a building that was unsafe collapsed in Bangladesh and killed 3,000 people. And that was due to outsourcing. So several British companies were getting clothes made there. They were held not to be ethical. So when people say that when you outsource to countries that have less health and safety regulation, that the labour you have that you need are in a more dangerous situation, you would just say, for example, the Rana Plaza collapse. So there are powerful examples that you can also bring into to show you that these things can actually happen. Before we move on to the questions and discuss the questions, I just want to say when you're actually making claims if something's positive or negative or whatever, it has three parts shown here. I've got a very simplistic claim, but I'm showing you the three things you must do within a claim. So the claim is, what is your claim? And the claim here is smartphones save lives. But then you have to say, well, why? Why do they save lives? Well, why do they save lives? Because they allow direct communication and they can also identify your location. And then the third part is, well, but how does this work? Well, because of the direct communication, you can call somebody for help. And because it knows where your right location is, other people can find out where you are. And if you're lost, then you can be found. So that's one of the ways. That's one of the ways. But what I often see students do is they'll have the blue bit. They'll say, "What smartphone saves lives?" Well, why do they do that? Well, they allow direct communication, identify your location, but you're leaving the reader to work out how does that actually work. Well, how does that save lives? So you need the red part, you need the process. And the other thing is smartphone saves lives. This means you can contact people and they can lost you. Then they might say, but how does that happen? What so there's that. So you've got to have all three parts is basically what I'm saying. But often I see people with not enough when they're making the claim, and there's three parts to a claim. And the other thing, of course, so you can tack on to the end of that, you'll see at the bottom of this slide is you can see there may be examples in the press you can bring in where people have been lost or trapped in the wild and they have contacted the authorities or whatever. And when they do that, the phone signal will let the rescuers know where they are. So just remember, when you're trying to make a claim about something, what's the claim, what's the reason for it, and how does it work? That's important. Okay, so some important points to remember. One is, don't overgeneralize. Like, it's very unlikely that any theory or model is going to be ideal all the time. There's going to be nuance within it. Try and pick up on the nuance of how good it is, or what it is. So don't, this is a brilliant thing, this works everywhere, and for that reason, also avoid absolute statements that you see this always works or it never works, etc. To try and avoid those. And also, don't be afraid to make intelligent suggestions or hypotheses. Don't sit on the fence, because as you construct your critique, the positives and the negative, you should get a sense of why something is a positive, useful thing, or it's a negative, dangerous thing. As you write, you should get that sense of it. So don't be afraid to based on what you've written, make some intelligent comment about it. And also that keep both sides of the coin. So something may be, when we say conclusions are plural in some way, what we mean is that parts of some system or process could be expensive, but parts could be inexpensive. Or something may be partially effective. It does lots of good things, but it has also some negative things. Basically, if you were evaluating how a company was doing for CSR, you're going to be plural. You're going to say this company's doing this well, it's doing this well, but it's not doing this well, or it's not doing this well. Which again, if you're giving something a score out of 10, then also don't ignore arguments you disagree with. You've got to build an accurate representation of GOTS. Don't cherry pick what you think is going to make. Don't go in with a preconceived idea. You're supposed to base your critique on what you've found through the academics, etc. So you can't or should not be trying to engineer some answer or another. You're honestly trying to give a balanced account of what's going on with both sides of any argument, both sides of any discussion.